Welcome back to Great Karate Myths, Debunking the Legends. In today's episode, we're tackling a question we get asked all the time. How do you actually go about researching kata? These days, the word research is thrown around pretty loosely, but it's more than just a Google search and a quick look at Wikipedia. In our group, we dig much deeper. Join us as we discuss the heuristic, hands-on, and often sobering reality of researching kata. So let's get into it.
Could I start, please? Because I'd like to say, well, unlike it's not as though it's academic research, but it's not like hermeneutics in say biblical studies, where you can look at you could take two versions, for instance, and I'm not endorsing or encouraging or discouraging the Old Testament, but you could look at two versions. You can look at the Septuagint, or you can look at the Masoretic text, one in Hebrew, one in Greek, and you could say, well, which is the true one, and then the scholars get down to it and they examine it paragraph by word, letter by letter, and that's hermeneutics. That's fine. We can't do that because we're not really looking at texts. Or if we are, they're written in movement. And as we've all agreed in the past, kata is a language left in movement. So we have to use a heuristic approach. It's hands-on. It's experimental. And this is at the core of this conversation from my point of view. It's trial and error. It is totally heuristic, hands-on. And also, unlike other types of research, which usually come in two flavors, as everyone knows, or many people know, qualitative or quantitative. Well, qualitative, why and how, and quantitative, how many or how much, or so, well, we can't really be doing much in the way of quantitative research. So we're always looking at qualitative. What is it? Why and how? And it's heuristic. It's heuristic. It's hands-on. It's trial and error, and it's experimental. That is at the core of it. And I think we've discussed this in the past. One of the starting points, which we've mentioned, and it's the deployment of Occam's razor. And any listener or viewer doesn't know what that is, Google it. But Occam's razor is completely well known, and that's not a bad starting point.
I think for someone coming in and wanting to have a look at the kata themselves, which I'd encourage everyone to do and not just take our word for it or anyone's word for it for that matter, is to start looking at the kata with the question, through the lens of the question, what was the original function? So looking at these kata, whichever one you pick, what was it originally intended for? Why, what questions does it answer? What problems does it solve? Why have this kata in the first place? But what was it originally for? And that's what underpins what Nathan started and what Nathan and us, the group, have continued. And that's what completely underpins the approach, is what was they originally for. And it's a very sobering question, because it removes a lot of what we like personally. So it doesn't matter what you want the kata to be, or what you fantasize they might be, or anything like that, or hope that, all your self-defense hopes and dreams and MMA and all the rest of it. You have to put all of that aside and just start with the kata itself. What have we got? What is it? So the kata I haven't really talked about much before, but it's something I'm actually currently looking at, is a kata called One Shoe. And MP, it's known as MP in Shoten. And it's a nice one to talk about, because I've got absolutely no idea what it is, what it was intended for. And so as I've been looking at it, and I've just made the notes I made today, and I've shared with the group, is to talk about, and are the things that I'm thinking about as I as I'm exploring this kata and going through it. And the big question is, well, what's it originally for? What was one shoe originally for? And one shoe it's got a bizarre opening. You have a hand over a closed fist. You do a kind of a sweep like leg raise, and then you drop down to your left. So I think it kind of rules out a lot just by the opening. But we'll get into all of that. So yeah, what underpins it? What's the original function of these kata?
Well, I think you said something really important there, Tom, and that's that the first thing really is that you have to put aside all of your own assumptions. You know, you have to, like you said, you have to put aside what it is you might want it to be. Because that having assumptions in your mind already, oh, this is definitely for fighting. This is definitely for practical application in 2025 on the mean streets of whatever. If you approach it with that already in mind, then you're going to go in the wrong direction. You need to put all of those things to one side and have an honest look at it. And as you just said, the opening of one shoe, it rules out a lot of things. Just having an honest look at that, rather than spending hours laboring and trying to turn that into some clever takedown or whatever, based on your assumptions. You can save yourself a lot of time and hassle by just practicing the kata and thinking carefully about the movements and what might actually be entailed in those movements. And that's really been the process for all the kata that we've tried to interrogate the original functions of. Nathan can definitely speak on this in more detail, but you know, when it comes to the sai kata, the Sanshin Seisan Sanseiryu, I would imagine that when the penny dropped for Nathan and he realised that he should be doing these kata holding a pair of sai, I imagine there was an element of, gosh, I spent rather a long time thinking otherwise. But maybe I'm putting words in your mouth there, Nathan, but maybe you could say something more about that.
Yeah, I can talk to your point about my feelings when that happened, because I'm the one that had them. Well, quite frankly, the first feeling was, and I'm still to this day personally embarrassed by my own response, which, as I say, I am disappointed. I'm not really a very good politician. I'm not interested in politics of any sort, really. But I was disappointed with my first response, my first thought when I got to that point of the original Sanshin Sai. My first thought was, it's very childish, very uncivilized, very primitive. That's a good word for it. It was a primitive response. It was a reptilian, reflexive response. Bury it. Bury it. Bury it. Like, yeah, I don't want to be caught having taken the cookie, so I'll hide the entire cookie jar. And then no one can see that there are any missing. It was a very primitive thought. It didn't last above a few seconds, I don't think, as I recall. And then, as it unfolded, shock, absolute, good grief, all that wonderful Shaolin stuff, and I'd been signed to Tuttle in a great publishing house, and my book had been printed in Japan, and it was all a sense of achievement. And then I followed it up with the Barefoot Zen with Samuel Weiser and the USA, and and it all seemed to be okay. And then then suddenly by 2003, oh no, this is a sai kata. It can't be. And and then the whole fabric of my belief system came tumbling down. It was severely challenged. And I had to move away from the assertions I'd only just made in around about 2000 when Barefoot Zen came out. When I said in that book that the Sanchin and these sort of Kata were Buddhism in motion, and that they should have been seen as moving meditation, and suddenly I'm confronted with this realization that the open-handed Weichi Sanchin, which was the precursor of Miyagi Chojin Sensei's closed fist Sanchin, because ultimately they came from the same source. They came from the same the one dojo, one kun in China. We know that, and they came from originally the same teacher, plural perhaps. So one was simply a development of the other. Then the whole idea, and of course, having taken a good hard look at monk fist through personal friends, through people who learned from, for instance, Master Guo in China, and these were this was a similar form to Sanchin, and one thought, yes, I can see Miyagi Chojin Sensei Sanchin in this monk fist, form in the Babulian or the Hapuren, whatever you want to call it, and I can see this. Yes, this is monk fist. This is all Shaolin. That was the big thing. This is Shaolin, and Shaolin was about meditation. It was about Chan or Jnana or Zen. This is about Zen. So yes, this should be moving meditation, and lo and behold, the oldest version that I could find and operate it that was operational was the Weichi version, and it turned out to be Sai, and that was, and I'll be completely open. Looking at that, you had to have it, and here's a point to bear in mind before I step out for a second here of this. You need the right version, and Tom raised this in his a little summary that he made earlier. We need to know, and that's very difficult. What is the right version? Which is why we always praise, and I'll do it again. I'll do it anytime. I will praise Nagamine Shoshin for his absolutely seminal work, The Essence of Okinawan Karate. In English, I can't say it in its original title because I don't know it. I've got a 1979. I bought it in 1979 in the English translation, and his kata are very accurate. And I'd imagine that's the one that Tom uses as a reference for his foray into Wanshu or NP. And the other source I would give credit for that's and this source is another source printed by Tuttle, is George Matson's I've got to get the title. He published a book in 1967 in which he demonstrated two kata, Sanchin and Seisan, and they are accurate. They are really accurate. So I'm grateful for those two authors, and I'm sorry I need to remember the title of the book. That's a bit of a shame. But Tom's
Isn't it
right.
The Way of Karate?
Yes, thank you, Tom. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes, by George E. Matson, published by Tuttle in 1967, and Tom's point on a little checklist was, you need to get the right version. That is absolutely crucial, because like for instance, as in computing, wrong information in, wrong information out. And we couldn't have got Naihanshin right if we didn't have Nagamine Shoshin Sensei's excellent preserved version in his book, The Essence of Okinawan Karate, and we certainly couldn't, because we couldn't work it out from. And no disrespect to Shotokan, I've paid my respects to Shotokan in many podcasts here. We couldn't get that from the Teki Kata because it had been so altered. In the same way, and to let someone else speak now. I think Tom will, but correct me if I'm wrong, Tom. You'll probably use the Wanshu of Nagamine Shoshin Sensei rather than the Impi of Shotokan.
Yes, definitely. And I think you've summed it up already, but the kata that have been changed, really, you can kind of disregard them. And the fact that the changes have taken place across different styles suggests to me that the original function was not known of these forms, which is why they can be creatively interpreted, creatively changed to fit with different ideas and different styles and things as they evolve. And so I think that you have to, in approaching the question of what is the original function, you have to try to find the oldest available version and try to work from that. And it's in Shoshin Nagamine's book, The Essence of Okinawan Karate, in terms of the kata in there, they've been remarkably accurate. I'm not saying that they all are, because I don't know, but the Chinto, Kusanku, Pasai, and Goju Shiho are amazingly accurate, absolutely incredible. And so that has so far in my kind of foray into Wanshu, I'll be using that version based on the fact that the versions of the other forms I've mentioned have been so accurate, and I can't find anything that is currently an older representation or a better representation. There are certainly versions that have been changed, like in Shotokan, in Wadaru, and others, and Sturu, and things like that. But those changes aren't based on an understanding of the original function. Those are changes based on the absence of the original function. So, as you pointed out, San Shinsei-san and San Seiryu in the so-called Naha traditions all come from one source. And we're really lucky. We've got incredibly accurate representations of those three forms because they're very nuanced. And so without those nuance, it might have been quite easy to miss that they were Sai. But we have the footage of Kani Weichi performing them. We've got George Matson's book. And we've got other very, very senior students of Kanban and Kani Weichi performing the forms with all of those lovely nuance and details in, which help to kind of answer that question of the original function. So, yeah, versions is so important. I don't think you'd get very, very far doing, no disrespect to Wadaru, I started out in it, but I don't think you'll get very far in understanding Naihanchi by doing the Wadaru version. And the changes that were kind of inspired by Choki Motobu in that. So, yeah, Matt, you look like you were going to jump in there.
Well, funnily enough, I was just thinking about my youth in Wadaru, and I was and thinking about the work that we've done on kata like Chinto and Kusanku, Pasai, and yeah, we could be laboring for 50 years and never get to anywhere near what the kata might have been for had we stuck with the Wado versions. So yeah, you're absolutely right. But the original thing I was going to jump in and say was that it is absolutely about the details. For me anyway, looking when Nathan originally presented the Weichi, Sanchin, and Seisan at the time, just the two, the penny really dropped when I paid more attention to the finer details of the hand positions in the seisan, the really strange hand shapes, and it never really occurred to me before. And of course, as soon as I put a sai in my hand and put my hand in the arm in the same position, oh yeah, it's so obvious. And so yes, to your point, we are really, really lucky that, you know, a good number of people over the years have actually preserved those hand positions, and yeah, those really small details, despite the fact that they have no, well, they obviously have no application in terms of, like, you know, fisticuffs or whatever many karateka want the kata to be, but yet they preserved those hand positions, and that was absolutely crucial. So yes, details are really, really important. And so for anyone, you know, looking to or thinking to look at the forms and try to discern the original functions, you've really got to pay attention carefully to the details.
I think just to add to that as well, what you see in the Goju-ryu is a kind of standardization of the techniques, and some of the more nuanced hand positions of those forms has become kind of more in line with general karate, if you like. So kind of obscure bent wrists or funny hand shapes are just kind of have been put aside in favor of the tight clenched fists and, you know, the standardized karate. And one of the difficulties with the so-called shuri type karate is that the standardization has already taken place, probably because the forms have been in Okinawa for longer than the Naha forms. So, you know, they were, with the 20th century, you know, early to mid 20th century is when those forms are making their way to Okinawa. So we have very, very, close representations to when they were learnt in China. With forms like Wanshu, we don't have a close representation, I think, to a close from when it was learned, because we have this standardization across those forms. So what I mean by that is something that we talked about in the Hikate and the Kime episodes, is that all of these kata now have Hikate. They all have sword hands, shuto, and they've all been standardized. So perhaps those more nuanced hand positions that might have existed, or those nuanced shapes and movements, have already gone through that standardization process in the so-called shuri traditions. So it's a little bit more difficult to approach things like pasai or kusanku because of that standardization. You have to kind of, you know, there's a little bit of a leap of faith there when you're going into the original functions of those forms as well, to what those nuances may have been. But you can kind of work it out once you're on, on the trail of the original function. So it's really, that content is so important, and those details are so important. So whatever is left and what there is in that oldest version or available, every detail kind of counts in terms of the content, and when you're trying to consider what you might be able to do with that form.
We're often asked, what is the primary source? But that's usually a loaded question. What people are actually asking is, who is the primary source?
Yeah. Well, we get asked all the time where the evidence is. We did an episode on this, didn't we? We talked about the kata are the primary sources. If there was evidence, the evidence would be what the function was. But there isn't. We've got the language, but it needs decoding. It's not that we haven't got the people want, like, well, what book is it written in, and what did Master, X, Y, and Z say about it? They didn't know what it was. That's the whole point. And that's why creative interpretation exists, and that's why versions exist. because all we've got is the kata, which, as you said, Sneer, the primary sources.
Yeah, could I speak to that the versions point, because I just point out that the peculiar fist clenching, the Naihanshin, which we've discussed on a number of occasions, which again we can see in Funakoshi Jichin Sensei's Karate Do Kyohan being used by Oishima Tsutomu Sensei all the way through the Teki 1, 2, and 3 series, is an example of the peculiar positions that have just been discussed here, and that's one of the key ones. Some of the strange fist positions and gripping positions that are conflated with tigers and animal in the Weighty series are clearly just about where your as Matt mentioned, it's really how your fingers are going to be around the guard of the sai when you've got the blade closed against the forearm, and then you find these peculiar positions which we've covered. But the point I wanted to jump in and make after Tom was to say versions. The one way of looking at this would be, please picture the following: a person in 1960 something, for example, could be any time from where photography exists, has a photograph taken of themselves, maybe some other people, in which that person is holding a newspaper front page in which there's a prominent headline displayed, and then that picture, and you can see the headline, then that picture is photocopied, and then the photocopy is photocopied, and the copy of the copy is photocopied, and so on. And by the time it's been photocopied a number of times, the headline can no longer be read. You can't see what it says because it's blurred. It's not, which is not the best analogy, but it's just in some way that's what's been going on in particularly in karate, because it does have that sort of kind of quite a stable history in Okinawa. Obviously, the history in Japan's quite late, and the history in the Western world is quite late. But ever innovative in the Western world, suddenly, the whole karate styles mushrooms like crazy. So, we've sort of gone from a handful of styles to an uncountable number. Who knows? But it's the photocopy analogy. It gets blurred and blurred, and I'll give a piece of evidence here, and what I mentioned, and no disrespect to Taekwondo, but Taekwondo has there are a number of forms which are similar to karate forms. So Taekwondo, allegedly a Korean martial art, associated with the Tom knows better than me, but the Hwang warriors in ancient times. I mean, that's just kind of a myth making. But basically, they are versions of the Shotoken kata, disseminated by Funakoshi Jichin Sensei, and taken to Korea, and then kind of revamped and nationalized as Taekwondo. Again, no disrespect intended to Taekwondo. But strangely, and Taekwondo is well known for its high kicks. It's primarily, a kicking based style. Lots of high kicks, and but it's interesting. One has to wonder. On examination, you find that there's there are 3 forms in there that just crop up. I can't pronounce them too well because I don't practice Taekwondo, but the Chogi forms. So there are 3 of them, and they're basically Taekwondo's versions of the Teki, which are Chodokan's versions of the Naihanchin of the Shorin Ryu, and one has to wonder what semi-obscure Chinese grappling techniques are doing in a high-kicking modern karate, Korean karate style, which is primarily a high-kicking style, and that's an example of this of how historically the forms have morphed, and most of that morphing has largely happened as a number of reasons. Some of them political and cultural and financial, and as many as you can think of. But the key one is that and this was my point, the function was lost. So with the function being lost, the interpreters can say what they like. And on a final, just to tie all of this together, we've in the past mentioned the Rosetta Stone in Egypt, the famous stone that finally Western scholars were able to translate the mysterious Egyptian hieroglyphs, and they could do so because there were three scripts shown on the one stone. There was the Egyptian or Kemetic hieroglyphs, which I would say were pretty much for very traditional record keeping and for priestly use. That would be the hieroglyphic. Then there was the demotic, which was basically for everyday Joe, for ordinary folk that could read, which probably wasn't a lot more than, if I'm not mistaken, 5% in dynastic Egypt. I must say this is quite late. So the Rosetta Stone's probably, I can't remember exactly, I think it's a couple of hundred before current era. So it's not sort of Tutankhamun. It's not 17th dynasty or something. It's actually quite late, and it's there because by the time the record, the edict is made, which is what the Rosetta Stone was, an edict. It was to tell everybody what was going on, and there were actually 27 similar stones. That they weren't all identical, and most of the others were less complete. So the one in the British Museum is probably, I believe, it's the most complete. But it's the three scripts showed the hieroglyphic, the demotic, and then the ancient Greek, which was it was the language of the Ptolemies, who were in control of Egypt about 200 before current era. So and what you're seeing is a linear. You're seeing a translation of material where there's clear evidence. Unfortunately, we didn't get anything like that with Karate Kata. It's almost as though we got just the hieroglyph. We didn't get anything that could allow us to. So again, I go back to I'm thinking, what is this? Using the word heuristic is not trying to be clever. It sums it up. It has to, what you have to do. So for anyone interested in doing this and following what Tom has raised, is that it has to be hands-on, trial and error. And to support completely what Matt has said, you have to drop your own personal bias and interest. You can't. So I want this to be a samurai practice. Well, tough. It's not. Or I want this to be Ikin Hisatsu. Well, tough. I'm thinking here of a Naihanchin. Naihanchin has got very little to do with Ikin Hisatsu. It's not. We all found that was why I freely admitted to my disappointment on the discovery of the Sai Why? Because it showed me that the original sentient was not going to be what I wanted it to be. It was going to be, or is, what it actually is. And I did not really want it to be psi.
And that's good research, isn't it? You run with the research where the evidence takes you and not what you want it to be. So that's good research. Yeah, even if it's disappointing. I think that's really important.
Another way to look at this is the telephone game, or Chinese whispers. In the study of cultural evolution, they call this transmission chaining, when a tradition isn't written down but is passed from person to person through practice. The original meaning can shift. That's exactly what we're navigating when we look at these kata.
We've got the movement, and that's where you have to start with it. So you have to, talking about one shoe again, because it's just it's so interesting. It's so weird, the opening. You have to take the cat. What have you got in the kata? So if you look at all the movements, you've got to kind of get to know that really, really well without adding anything to it. No flourishes, no flavor, anything, until you work out what the underlying function of it is. But what can you do with that movement, that collection of movements? How can you operate with it? What can you do? If it doesn't look like a fight, then it probably isn't. It's really that simple. And so you take the kind of more obscure movements and things and see what might be possible with them. And you kind of build out from there. And then, when Matt and I have worked together, what we do is we use resistance. So we play around with the ideas. And then what happens when you apply resistance? A lot of ideas quickly get kind of knocked out the way. But when someone applies resistance, that's definitely not going to work. So resistance is an important part of it. So you get some ideas about what you can do with the content of the kata without adding anything. And then you test it with someone and see where it might go. And often things unravel from there. And when sometimes you get a lead and you follow it up, and then you kind of can explore what kind of context it might have been used for. We've talked about context before loads of times, different possible contexts for using, like policing, bodyguarding, all the rest of it. But that resistance is really, really important. And finding the common thread. Why are these techniques collected together? Why is this kata being created? What problems does it solve? What questions does it answer? So, that's kind of taking that on a little bit further.
Could I just jump in here to go back to that Matt's point about assumption and Kev, which Kev very capably supported, that you have to take out your own sort of bias, your own interest in what you want it to be, which is why I was so challenged. I was roundly criticised by one commentator who said, "Oh, now Johnson's changed his mind. We've now moved from Buddhist meditation to weapons." Yeah, that's the nature.
It might have been more than one nation.
Thank you, Tom. But I wanted to go back to this. Yeah, as Matt said, take out your own what you want it to be, or what. I think it is one shoe. One shoe is. I can't quite remember all of it. I don't. It's not a kata I practice, actually, to be completely open. But I think it's either. Is it one tunnel? I mean, it is one shoe. Correct me if I'm wrong. That's the one with the hidden fist punch. Is that? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Bingo. I'm there. It's got, so to Matt's point, it's got it's called the hidden fist punch. Now that could be a mess in translation, in the English translation, what is essentially a book written, by an Okinawan, but the hidden fist punch, which is a bizarre. Can you imagine it? So the fist is positioned behind the lower spine, and then sort of suddenly sprung out and ha! I've got a hidden fist behind my back. It's absurd, like that is good. So, you're just like a child. You can't see my fist. It reminds me of little, very small children who very small, who think that if they close their eyes, you can't see them. It's that kind of thinking. If I hide my fist behind my back, I can surprise you with a hidden fist punch. It's absurd. Anyone looking at you, and that's why we would, within our group, we would typically not accept that banal, ridiculous kind of a hidden fist punch. Like if I put my hand behind my back, you can. Now, if you had a weapon, that might be different. So, that might be for a person like me a starting point. That might be a starting point. But I'm not saying that's what it's for or anything to do with that. What I'm basically saying is, just because you put your fist behind your back and then suddenly spring it out in a punch, it is absurd, and particularly when as I recall, the other arm is not hidden. Also, it's deployed. So, if this was a starting position and both of the fists were hidden, one could be, for instance, assuming a neutral position of non-aggression, and you might get away with explaining it that way. But when the other hand is in the position of a technique, I think it's sorry, Tom, I can't remember. I think it's a middle level or down block, a get in eye position, or one of them.
We'll put a video link in.
That's
so
a good
people
point.
can have
That's a good point. I think it's a get in eye position. So the other arm is in play in some technique or other. So it's not as though you're concealing any, starting point to fool your opponent. So the idea that this is a hidden fist punch is quite crude and primitive, and speaks to Matt's point about making an assumption. So the fist is behind the back, and as I say, I did start this point by saying it could just be not the best translation into English. So I don't really know what the Japanese, or I don't know if I think it would have been. I don't know whether Nagamine wrote. I think he probably wrote in Japanese. I don't know whether Hogan's a dialect of speech rather than a script. So let's just keep it simple. The Japanese may have spoken about that technique in another way, but it's definitely not a hidden fist punch. You can't suddenly just hide your fist behind your back like a child and then spring it out into a middle-level attack. Absurd thinking, really, and part of the thinking that made a Chinese civil arrest series that was recorded incredibly accurately and transmitted extremely well from China through Nagamine Sensei's Matsubayashi Shorin-ryu to end up, sorry Taekwondo if I offend anyone, boulderized, completely changed beyond. It's still there, the vestiges are still there, but it's been so altered in by the time it gets to Taekwondo that I just refer everyone back to my photocopies of photocopies analogy. In the end, what was originally a clear photograph of people and a newspaper headline becomes totally incomprehensible. The headline becomes unreadable, and in the extreme case, you can't even work out how many people are in the photograph.
Let's talk more about the possible context of use for these techniques.
Yeah.
To understand the why behind the movement, we have to look at the environment it grew out of and consider the broader cultural landscape of the time. This includes the influence of theatre, opera, stories of heroism, religion, and warfare.
Yeah, I mean, you've got the context of the pure closer to martial end of things, like civil policing. I don't know if it was called that or how they would have described it, but just using modern terms, but bodyguarding, palace guarding, security, militia as well, pirates, military applications possibly, but then you've also got theatrical, religious, ritual, or magical operations, all kinds of things, and not necessarily all separate. They might not there might not have been such a thing as a purely a pure martial function form. Some of it may have involved some kind of ritual element, or those kinds of practices were certainly connected. And that's when you get, looking at your secondary sources, which would be your history, in particular local history of the time. So looking at the history of China, what was going on then, around the times these forms were making their way over, what was being practiced, what was happening in the culture. There's some really, really great research going on out there with people making the connections of all these different contexts and things that were happening in the culture around the sort of 17th, 18th century in China. It's really fascinating. So you have to, that kind of comes in later, I think, as well. So finding a thread and finding out when it might have been used. And just to speak to Nathan's point about the hidden fist, another example of that you find in the Goju Shiho, where they describe a sidestepping movement as possibly a drunken boxing type movement. And, again, the idea of just pretending to be, it's ridiculous, but actually my idea on that, or suggestion is that probably connects it to a theatrical tradition, and there's some storytelling in there. So I wonder if Goju Shiho itself is actually from a theatrical tradition rather than a pure kind of a martial end of things. Whereas if you look at the use of the sai, that's certainly more the martial end of things. So it's not always easy to place these things, and it's working out what you can do with the content of the form first. The kata are the primary sources, and that's where you got to spend your time almost embedding yourself and living in those movements and kind of experiencing that, as Nathan's already described, before anything else. So yeah, there's a wide range of possibility of kind of connected context, but it's being careful with it as well. It's very easy to get kind of run away with it, and so it's just taking your time.
Well, I think that's a really nice example of how paying attention to the details can give you a bit of an insight into the context, or at least steer you in the right direction. It would be it would be slightly absurd to take that sidestep that you're talking about in Goju Shiho and think, right, okay, well, that's drunken boxing, and now I'm going to work out how to apply that against an opponent on the mat. That would be a really silly line to go down, and also would just highlight the assumption that's being made that whoever put these forms together intended it to be some kind of empty-handed fighting technique, but clearly they had no idea. It makes we've spoken about we've mentioned boxing and all sorts of stuff in previous episodes, and all those people who labor under the assumption that everything that seems to look like a strike obviously is, but what they miss is that well, just because these forms were created quite a long time ago, it doesn't. They were created by human beings with the same physiology as us. It surely wouldn't have escaped their attention that, you know, an oizuki is not the best way to strike somebody. It wouldn't, you know, you don't have to go to like a formal class or anything like that to work out that people naturally go about hitting each other with what look like jabs, crosses, hooks, and uppercuts, and all of that. So there's already an assumption that the people that put these forms together didn't really know what they were doing, and so that seems to give, you know, creative interpreters free rein to start altering the way that forms look, so that you know, the opening of Naihanchi is an elbow smash to the face or whatever. Yeah, it's attention to the details. It gives you some important clues. You know, the hidden fist and punch and all of that is clearly not. It's clearly not for some kind of fisticuffs. So leave that alone. And as you say, Tom, live in the movement. Think about it. Practice it a lot, and try to think slightly outside of the ordinary assumptions about what it could be for.
It's that, like you said, but the creative interpretation, you can do whatever you want, and you're sort of almost spoiled for choice now. You know, YouTube can be really helpful for seeking inspiration and ideas for what movements can be, but you can also end up with, you know, down a rabbit hole of just making it up, and probably, you know, there's loads of really good applications, for example, for the Pinan forms. If you look at them, some really, really clever ideas. They've been creatively interpreted. Some fantastic stuff. Was that what Itosu intended? I really doubt it, if he intended anything. I don't think that the applications that are being made up today were absolutely anything to do with what was behind those forms being put together. And that, in the same way, I don't think that a lot of the kind of do or die fighting applications given to these antique forms are what was intended for them in the first place at all. And it changes the way that you approach it when you're trying to simply understand what was the thinking that went into creating what was going on that led to these forms being created in the first place, as opposed to what can I make up for these movements.
Two important points that I'd like to introduce now are to what Matt and Tom have just said. In terms of anyone interested in how to work this stuff out, or where our confidence in that which we have done comes from, two important pointers for anyone interested in looking at antique kata. One, not in this order, by the way. One is the embu, or the embusen, or the floor plan. What's the footwork doing? You know, and I don't mean the Jackie Chan film where Drunken Master, is it, where he's got the foot happens everywhere and he copies it. I don't mean that, but look at the embusen, the floor plan. What's the kata? Where is it stepping? What's it doing? That's one to really be taken into consideration. And a great example of that was Naihanchin. No, it wasn't fighting on a long boat or in a narrow alleyway. It was grappling the person, taking to the floor, and literally putting them on their lungs, on their back. You would not want to move backwards or forwards to achieve that. The second point, which is crucial, is to really understand a kata, an antique kata, an authentic kata, it has to be considered that the movement. So if you're looking at any particular movement, you really you must consider the movement that precedes it and the movement that follows it, because there will be a correlation, a relationship between those. So looking at the Japanese three nens thinking, or the idea that there would be, so we're looking at, there's a terrible quasi fake tradition of taking just one move out of a kata and saying, this is a move, it's like a standalone move, here it is, and I can do this with it. You really have to consider the move that came before it and the move that comes after it. Then you can begin to get some idea of why an entire sequence appears, be it Sanchin, Seizan, Sanseiryu, it doesn't, Naihanchin, Jinto, Pasai, Kusanku, doesn't matter. You then can get some idea of why this kata, any particular kata being studied, is in the order it's in. And that's crucial. And to get to any particular movement, you do have to understand the movement that came before it and the movement that came after it. And then the fourth thing to do is to see how they all go together and therefore why they are in the order that they are in. Crucial. If you don't get that, then all you've got are these pick out of the air. Here's a block. Here's what looks like a strike. Oh, here's what looks like a poke to the eye. And that's which is, pretty much, unfortunately, why a lot of karate kata interpretation went that way.
Just to add to the Embry said there, the movement pattern, the floor pattern, something peculiar that I've come across in a couple of the forms, one of them being Sanseiru and the other one being Goju Shiho, is that they actually are mapping something from Chinese cosmology. So you have something called the Luosho square, which is a 9's 3x3 box, and it's connected to ancient Chinese cosmology, the Book of Changes, and the 8 trigrams, and you find the stepping pattern in other Chinese martial arts like Bagua. They call it walking the 9 palaces, and it connects to ancient cosmology. I'm not going to go into all the details here because I don't know it too well, but I've got some notes on it. But both of those forms in different ways walk the 9 palaces just as and it's really quite fascinating. So what might look like random stepping, actually it's not at all. So there's more to the emblem as well, and that to me suggests that there's more to it. So that would certainly speak to some kind of ritual aspect that was included in some of these forms. The two I've mentioned, Sanseiru and the Goju Shiho, both from different sources, but yeah, they seem to have absorbed some of these rituals into the way the kata are put together. So yeah, I think it's really important that the way, the directions that you're moving in, the directions that you turn towards, and the way that you turn, and all of those details have some kind of significance. I'm not saying it's the case for all the forms, but certainly the antique forms, I think it is the case. I don't know what the embusen of other forms means yet, but I have some ideas, and they all kind of converge on that point of being connected to cosmology and some sort of ritual practice as well. Yeah, just to add to Nathan's there.
I could like to add to your addition, Tom. Well, this cultural and symbolic association is anthropologically, so for any study of any kind of human cultures and societies, it's valid because we can only express ourselves in the culture and environment in which we find ourselves. So without going too far with that, it if I suggested that, so in the East we can talk about Taoism and Buddhism, but if we apply a consistent principle, we could take it somewhere which wouldn't seem to have any connection or association, and I'll take that to European swords. So I'll take it to 10th to 14th century European swords. Wow, that's a bit of a stretch. Okay, and I'd like to start with the Ulfbert sword that was a legendary, almost mythological swordsmith in Europe, probably a Frankish smith, German/French, and the quality of the steel that was produced was unfathomable. It was for its period. It was unbelievably high quality. It was better than anything in existence in Europe because it was so pure. But this, if you look at it, and that was an unbelievable sword. So let me give you a timeline. 10th century will do. A bit sloppy, but that'll do. And each blade bore the imprint Ulfbert. It's not one smith because this tradition carries on for a couple of hundred years or more. And here's the point. When you look at the guard, the sword guard, the hilt and the pommel, but 200 years later, the sword guard is elongated, and geometrically and proportionally, it becomes very cruciform. It becomes, so although the people that used the Ulfbert sword were Christians, and we know that about the Christian knights, and we know about the Knights Templar, like them or not, but and the Hospitallers, two different orders of. These were Christian warriors, and by a couple of hundred years, say by the 13th, 14th century, the sword guard and the geometry of the sword has taken on a very cruciform, a very Christian, symbolic, and not everyone, but it's common imagery is to see the Christian knight praying on a knee with his sword in the ground, and then his sword is making the shape of the crucifix. It's very ritual and symbolic, and which is very much a westernized European version of ritual symbolism, of which Tom was describing in a Chinese counterpart, in terms of a floor plan of directions and numbers. And I put it to you guys that this is the same, or it's consistent with typical human thinking in how you attest value to something, and you attach it to the divine, to the grand and numinous. You attach it to the universe, the cosmos, to numerology, to God or the gods. It's common across everything. You find the same thing in religions and spiritual practices globally. One is attesting to powers higher than oneself, and in some regard, one is hoping to employ them or deploy them or invoke them or be associated with them, which ends up in a much more corrupted way with things like lucky numbers. Why is 108 considered to be a lucky number? Why, is there a discrepancy in Wing Chun's wooden dummy between an original number of 116 wooden man techniques that's cut down to 108 because of the Cantonese penchant for that particular number as a lucky number? This is just typical of human behavior, and so we see the splendid cruciform sword the shape of it, the longer sword guard, actually more practical than the one found on the earlier Ulfbert swords. But the blades, the finest blade was probably the early Ulfbert blade. But yep, the later blade that had been more Christianized, was highly functional and highly culturized. And I think this is a common experience and practice across humanity, regardless of culture or race or any of that stuff. So we are just seeing consistent human behavior in the creation of its social, combative, and religious more values, expressing its mores and what it believes in.
I think it might be worth adding just on that, Nathan, that yes, everything that you've just described has for much of human history been the case, but we are in a peculiar position now of looking at these forms in a sort of a very sort of modern secular way, and we have to be careful of that. I think this speaks to the whole context. Scott Park Phillips makes the point really nicely that when he's investigating Tai Chi and Bagua, and he talks about the theatrical and symbolic and martial aspects of the movements, that everything that you've just described, Nathan, all of the symbolism, the appeals to divinity and numinous aspects, in the culture in which these things were created, they were not separate. They weren't separate things in the way that we tend to think of them now. And so we do have to be careful when we look at these forms, to take into careful consideration what the views were of the people at the time and around these forms. Because historically, the total separation of ordinary life from spiritual aspects and a real cultural focus on materialism is actually an exception, historically speaking. Most people have not thought that way for much of human history. We're in the throes of it now, so we just have to be aware that can shape the way that we tend to look at some of these forms, and insist that it must be for just purely combative application. Well, that might not be the case, and Tom's really nicely pointed that out. There's a lot of really peculiar things about some of these forms, and you have to consider that the people that put them together probably had a whole multitude of purposes for it.
I think it makes you wonder how the kata were practiced originally as well. So not just what the original function was, but how often did people practice? What was the nature of the practice? Goju Shiho, for example, isn't a particularly long form. So would they've done it a few times? Did they do it? How was it that, that we don't have any idea. So, and again, that's why I think we have to keep turning our attention to, as best we can, understanding the original function and where it comes from, and then we can take a good old guess.
Well, I think when I was at school, certainly, we did recitation, but you'd recite a poem, and the poem is recorded. And you would recite it, and you would study it, and you would try to become able to sound it properly, and and so on. But it wasn't. It was just a means to an end, and I think that what's happened is that karate kata, which probably once upon a time were a means to an end, became the I'm guilty of this. Yeah, it became the property or the interest in purchasing hobbyists, of which I'm one. So, the people that devised the kata and taught them and practiced them, and as Matt's correctly said, they were we have to take into consideration, you both said, everyone said the culture and the time and the purpose. But they weren't worshipped, and they were just teaching tools for teachers. Yeah.
Was there anything else you wanted to add, Tom?
Yeah, so just, for someone wanting to take a look at or take a run at looking at the original functions of the kata, we've talked across lots of different aspects of it, but start with the kata, see what's there, choose your version wisely, and experiment and get other people in to give you some resistance and someone to, explore the movements and possible functions with, and just keep going over it and over it again, and keep challenging new conclusions as well. The last thing I'll say on it is that it takes a really long time as well. This is not something that happens in an afternoon, so you don't expect to meet up with someone and go, well, I've cracked it. It can take years, and so I'm not saying it will take everybody that, but to approach it with a really open mind and send us your results as well. Send us what you come up with. We'd love to see it, and for more people to kind of embrace exploring the original functions of kata, as well as creative interpreting them as well.
That brings us to the end of our discussion into researching kata. Today, we've shifted the focus from static academic study to a heuristic approach, reminding us that kata is a language left in movement, not just a text to be read. Before we go, let's recap the roadmap for researching kata. Drop the bias, find a primary source version, and test every theory against an uncooperative partner. If you're embarking on your own research, be patient. It's a journey of years, not an afternoon. We'd love to hear about your own discoveries, so reach out in the comments section. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. And we'll see you in the next episode to debunk more legends.